Production of this program was made possible in part by the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, as recommended by the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, the McKnight Foundation, maintaining and restoring a healthy, sustainable environment in the Mississippi River Basin, and these funding partners.
A third of the state was grassland. 20,000 square miles of Minnesota was grassland. And today, most of it's gone. It's hard to know a landscape when that's all that remains of it.
Landscapes really do have a history. They change all the time. And we are certainly, as humans, intervening into that process of change with an outcome that we can't actually know.
And it matters enormously whether you are an Indian person seeing a landscape that is home to grazing herds of bison and see that as the sustenance of your community's being. And contrast that with thinking of the same landscape as a great inland empire, the hinterland of a great growing city.
What happened at St. Anthony Falls changed the entire region's landscape.
Minnesota's history is written on its landscapes and by them. From the ancient people who carved these petroglyphs more than 5,000 years ago to today's asphalt nomads, Minnesotans have been shaped by the landscapes they live in and in turn have changed these landscapes, often beyond recognition.
And the dilemma we face is that these forces of ours upon the world are getting rid of the very resources upon which we built this society that we have.
In the transformation of the Minnesota landscape, much has been gained and much has been lost. This series uses the lessons of the past in weighing our choices for the future. The stories that follow are pieces of a larger tale, as epic as human history itself. These are stories of the land as it once was, as it has evolved and been influenced by human hands. Histories of a place on which our uncertain future lies. To truly understand the landscape west of Lake Superior, one must understand the creative power of moving and melting ice. Beginning some 2.4 million years ago, the Earth's climate began to grow cold and then to enter a cycle of cooling and warming that has lasted to this day. Year-long winters in northern Canada produced snows that accumulated into compacted ice sheets, miles thick in places. Sheer weight sent them south in repeating cycles of advances and retreats. About 16,000 years ago, the glaciers again began to melt, revealing a barren and forbidding landscape. The melting glaciers left enormous lakes of frigid meltwater, raging, ice-choked rivers.
It must have been horrendous. The water was cold, the rocks were raw and tumbled in great moraines. Huge animals wandered the landscape. There was the mastodons and the mammoths that were big hairy elephants that wandered in great big herds.
As the climate warmed and the glaciers melted, the landscape changed dramatically. Over the next 14,000 years, a series of different plant communities marched across Minnesota. Pine moved in from the east. Deciduous forest from the south. As the climate dried out, prairie swept into the region. 5,000 years ago, the weather became cooler and wetter, sending the forest back west while the prairie retreated, leaving Minnesota blanketed with 3 rich biomes. And from the beginning, people were here.
Well, this place, Minnesota Makoche, we call it, could be translated as where the waters reflect the heavens. So this area or this land, we have a relationship that is really thousands and thousands of years old with it.
I like to say that this area never was a wilderness. The whole idea of wilderness is a misnomer. Just the minute that ice melted and the ice fields were to the north of here, there were people here. They had rankings and societies made up of all kinds of specialties. And they had a mythology that would fill several Bibles, and that they were very old and very ancient even then. Their knowledge of herbs and the landscape around them could fill up botanical textbooks, and they carried all this material right in their heads.
Acutely aware of how natural systems worked, they knew how to manipulate elements of their constantly changing environment, not only to survive, but to prosper. One such element was fire.
Native Americans frequently used fire for many, many purposes. They saw that it was a part of nature, that it in fact recycled nutrients, promoted lots of plant growth, which then attracted lots of game animals.
But fire wasn't the only way in which Native Americans shaped the land around them. By the 1700s, both the Dakota and Ojibwe who made their homes here were shaping the land in significant ways.
We had our hand on that land. It's always a really important concept to remember, because a lot of people think that this land was a vast, untouched wilderness, which indigenous people just kind of wandered through and picked things and gathered things and hunted things. Instead of recognizing that actually, whether it was burning the underbrush to keep your forest good, to keep good grass that would grow and get rid of some of them wood ticks, or whether it was managing your wetlands, your beaver populations, managing your water levels for your wild rice crop, our community heavily interacted with our land traditionally. I think that by and large within our native traditions there is this immense ethic, this Minopematisewan, this way that you live, which is something to do with the continuity of living in one place, of observing intergenerationally the changes on land, and the behavior of all of your relatives that are four-legged and two-legged and, trees and winged. You are very cognizant of your behavior as a part of a whole, and the ramifications of your behavior in that bigger picture, and that if you're going to live there for 10,000 years, you better figure that out.
The world those early people knew so well was in fact a place of some remarkable convergences. Here, near the heart of the North American continent, was a place where the level, treeless plains of the west met the rolling, wooded hills of the east. Here, too, the continent's great weather systems collide, where dry westerlies stripped of their moisture by the Rockies meet wet, warm air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico and the cold weather systems coming out of Canada. It's a collision that makes for a place drier and warmer to the southwest, wetter and cooler to the northeast, climatic conditions critical to what can grow here.
Minnesota is at the meeting place, if you will, of these three major ecological systems. We call them biomes.
The prairie of the mid-continent, the great eastern deciduous forest, and the mixed northern forest of pine and hardwoods all converge in Minnesota. So too do three of the continent's major watersheds. From here, the Red River runs north to Hudson's Bay. The Great Lakes flow east to the Atlantic. And the continent's greatest river, the Mississippi, rises here and flows south to the Gulf of Mexico. A meeting place of water, weather, topography, and biomes that would one day be captured by the boundaries of Minnesota.
I think one of the really remarkable things about Minnesota is precisely that it sits on so many key boundaries that define the mid-continent of North America.
An ecological crossroads that by the 1600s became a cultural crossroads as well, as humans vied for the resources of the area, a process that profoundly changed the ecological landscape itself, and one that continues to this day. In the mid-1600s, an event took place in Europe that would have far-reaching consequences for this land west of Lake Superior. When King Charles I of England donned a beaver hat in court, he started a fashion craze that lasted for over a century and sent European fur traders deep into the heart of North America in search of beaver. To the French, who were the first to arrive here in the late 1600s, and the British who replaced them, the land was a place of impossible abundance. A well-watered world, rich in fur-bearing animals and game.
Beaver, of course, is what everyone hears about, and it certainly was very important. This was a great cash market, but other things were hunted also. The so-called fine furs, what we now know as ermine, which is the winter coat of the weasel, marten, pine marten, fisher, fox, wolf, raccoon, all of those things were hunted and traded.
For thousands of years, native peoples had used the network of rivers and lakes left by the glaciers to transport trade goods by boat. Now that system was used to export furs to markets in Europe and to bring in manufactured European goods. Critical to the trade west of Lake Superior were the Dakota and Ojibwe, who did all the hunting and trapping and supplied the European traders with food. But where the Europeans saw these animals as simply resources, the Indians continued to see them as important parts of their personal landscape.
The attitude to the beaver was one of that the beaver has to be treated with tremendous respect, because the beaver brings all these things, and it was the beaver that actually brought these things, even though in reality they got to see the trader bringing knives and nails and traps and kettles.
The Indian base fur trade lasted for over 250 years and its effect on the animal populations across the region was relatively minor. But beginning in the 1830s, a variation of the trade arose that would have drastic consequences. What happened to the bison in Minnesota was a harbinger of things to come.
St. Paul became an important transshipment point for buffalo robes. St. Paul was at the head of navigation on the Mississippi, and goods could be brought in by Red River ox cart down from Pembina and placed on steamboats and taken down to the railroad terminus in Galena and shipped to the east.
Bison had long been an important part of the landscape in Minnesota. They were essential to the Dakota, who not only hunted them for food, hides, and other implements, but also for the fur trade. Bison could be found throughout Minnesota. They were particularly numerous on the open floor of the Red River Valley. In 1801, Alexander Henry, a British trader with the Hudson Bay Company, recorded a typical encounter.
At daybreak, I was awakened by the bellowing of buffaloes. I dressed and climbed my oak for a better view. I'd seen an almost incredible number of buffalo in the fall, but nothing in comparison to what I now beheld. The ground was covered at every point of the compass, as far as the eye could reach, and every animal was in motion.
On that winter day, the bison of North America numbered somewhere between 30 and 50 million, an untold multitude in Minnesota alone. In a remarkably brief time, they would be hunted to near extinction in the state, primarily by a people known as the Métis.
They were mainly a mixture of Cree, Ojibwe, and French, although there were some who were Scottish and other groups.
Based in Canada at the northern end of the Red River Valley, the Métis were among the first to discover the benefits and pitfalls of specializing in the growing cash economy.
They made their living outside of the traditional role of European peoples in the fur trade as traders. They spent a good part of the year hunting buffalo, and they were also the people who brought the buffalo robes down to St. Paul.
Responding to a fierce demand for hides and tongues from the east, the Métis in the 1830s developed a mass hunting strategy that was unparalleled in its efficiency. On July the 4th, 1840, a writer named Alexander Ross described one such hunt. The picture he presented was astonishing.
1,210 ox carts, 620 hunters with over 1,000 wives and children, 740 guns, and over 1,000 horses.
When they finally returned 6 weeks later, they carried with them over 1 million pounds of hides and meat. Others hunted the Minnesota herds as well, but none were as efficient as the Métis. Their participation in an unfettered market that had no regard for the ecological landscape rapidly had its effect. In fewer than 50 years, the bison were all but eliminated from the state. Other elements of the old landscape would now follow. By the mid-1830s, the Americans had firmly established political control of the Great Lakes region and much of the land west of the Mississippi. But political control did not mean ownership, and this was a problem for the new government in Washington. For although the Indians held no deed to it, the land belonged to the tribes and bands who'd lived on it for as long as memory.
Traditionally, our Indian people in my community and in other Indian communities, by and large, we hold our land collectively, and then we had individual family or extended family use rights. And those are allocated in a whole variety of ways. But that is a totally different concept of land ownership than private property, a use right. In that, we take that, even that term Anishinaabe-Aking, they say that doesn't necessarily mean that land that belongs to you, it means the land to which you belong.
For the Americans, however, that same land represented only potential, significant only for how it could be used to produce income, something that could be transferred from one people to another with a signature on a piece of paper.
Let's take the state of Minnesota. If we had a map of it and we made it like a jigsaw puzzle, or we made it like a patchwork quilt, a series of treaties and a series of agreements negotiated between the various bands was made.
Piece by piece, from 1837 to the dawn of the 20th century, the Dakota and Ojibwe were forced to cede their land to the U.S. government.
Those treaties were very unfair. It was unrealistic to start with, the whole idea at that point of a treaty. And the idea that it was a bargaining session was also false, because there can't be any bargaining where all the power is on one side. And everybody knew where the power was. I mean, the actual money paid for the land, how could you pay for a way of life with money?
We are dying and fading away. We drop to the ground like the trees from the axe of the white man. I grieve but cannot turn our fate away. The sun, the moon, the rivers, the forest we love so well, we must leave. We will soon sleep in the ground. Ojibwe Elder LaPointe, 1854.
The first settlers to the territory of Minnesota brought with them a view of the land that would profoundly change it. It was a powerful vision whose details had been spelled out nearly a half-century before in the Land Ordinance of 1785.
One of the most important transformations in the Midwestern landscape is, in its beginnings, also in some ways the subtlest, which is the passage in 1785 of the Great Land Ordinance, which for the first time set out a rule under the new United States government, before we had a Constitution, and arguably as important as the U.S. Constitution, a process for surveying the land.
The Congress needed to pay off its debts from the Revolutionary War, and it had won all this land. And it needed both to be able to raise money to pay off those debts, but also to be able to have some orderly way of settling that land.
The legacy of that historic land survey is still apparent in the grid pattern that dominates the Midwestern landscape.
We can hardly think of a landscape without the grid if we do pause to think about it, because it's like the air we breathe. It's the context in which we all play out our lives.
One of the key proponents of that grid and the land survey that created it was Thomas Jefferson.
And as I guess we all know, Jefferson's notion was there that democracy needed to have a base of farmers who were landowners, and if that was going to be true, they had to be able to get access to ownership to federal land and to be able to know what they owned. And that's the reason for the surveys.
So it decided on this idea of dividing land into 6-mile square townships, and that they were actually going to go out and survey each one of those townships prior to settlement, prior to the sales of those lands.
Good. Right there. Duck.
Using the simple tools of a compass and measuring chain, crews began measuring and surveying the entire United States west of the Appalachians.
And working its way west across the Northwest Territory. And then as the Louisiana Purchase begins to get surveyed, it marches its way all the way across the Louisiana Purchase.
It took more than half a century to survey Minnesota. Crews began in the 1840s and continued through the remainder of the 19th century. In the process, surveying crews measured more than 150,000 miles of grid lines.
In meandering in Section 6, July 1st, the mosquitoes and no-see-em flies have the snow and water at an advantage in punishing a human being. I have been stung by mosquitoes in this township while standing in snow knee-deep. Surveyor's Record, Lake County.
In marking the trees and other prominent features at specific points along the transects, surveyors noted significant geographical features.
Yep, straight to the meander.
The trees, the presence of minerals, and the quality of soils. In doing so, they were instructed to pay particular attention to the commercial potential of the lands they surveyed.
The surface of this township is gently rolling. The timber is very dense, tall, and straight. In sections 2 and 3, there is much white pine good for lumber. The swamp in section 6 is suitable for cultivation. The water is clear and abounds in speckled trout. Surveyor Record, St. Louis County.
More than anything else, what the grid achieved, what this vast land survey was designed to accomplish, was making it possible to buy and sell land. The whole purpose was to take nature, ecology, and transform it into real estate, make it possible to buy and sell it, and strikingly, buy and sell it without even knowing what it looked like. You could sit in Washington, D.C. or in Philadelphia, look at a map, look at a cell of a grid, and say, sure, I'll buy that, plunk down your money, and own it, without ever having walked the land.
But the ordinance had other profound, unforeseen consequences. By dividing the landscape without regard to nature, the grid served to play havoc with the ecological systems that underlay it.
Ecologically, it had some problems. Because all of a sudden you've got people who are purchasing land side by side, and the line that divides them, this arbitrary line, may go right through the middle of a swamp. Or it may go through woodlands. Or it may go through some other ecological area that, for purposes of maintaining the environment, we would be much better off keeping that piece together.
From a strictly biological perspective, the impact was so immense we can hardly even fully comprehend it right now. It was happening at all the different levels of biological organization, if you will. It's happening at the genetic level by dividing up populations. It's happening at the species level, some species responding differently to these new divisions in the landscape. It's happening at the community level and the ecosystem level.
Although they couldn't know it then, the survey would be the template for the total reordering of the biological landscape, on a scale not seen since the disappearance of the last ice sheet. But the full ramifications of the survey would not be understood for years. What was clear in the 1840s was that now there was land to be legally had and money to be made in the territory of Minnesota.
We are here at the Falls of St. Anthony, and this is the place that gave Minneapolis its name. Minneapolis means waterfall city. It came from the combination of the Dakota Minnehaha and Polis for city, and it's the reason we have a city at this point on the Mississippi River.
Dwarfed now by the very city they made and covered in concrete, It's difficult today to even see the falls, let alone grasp their historic significance. But they were a crucial nexus where the power of nature and human capital came together in the late 1830s to transform Minnesota and the region. In its natural state, the water here dropped 18 feet over a ragged shelf of limestone.
It's a place where you can actually see power. It's hard to see energy in the landscape. Even if you carefully train your eye, it's hard to sense a cornfield as a lot of energy. But when you go to the falls, you can see the energy.
Just as important, however, was where on the landscape the falls was located. Situated in the ecological seam between prairie and forest, it lay within easy reach of the great pinery to the north. Located just 7 miles above the head of navigation of the continent's greatest river system, the Mississippi, the falls also lay in close proximity to both the Minnesota and St. Croix rivers.
In a way, it was like you and I were building a perfect landscape, and we knew we were going to have regional complementarity. That is, the wood that was grown in the north was going to be needed by the farmers in the south. And there's this nice point in the middle where we can saw all that wood up and make it into planks and, and send it down. So, you hate to read too much into these landscapes in a sense of cosmic plans. But it looks like some cosmic planner was at work.
The strategic location of the falls at just the right spot on the landscape was a fact that was immediately grasped by the pioneer entrepreneurs.
Water power is an old technology. It's been used for many, many years. It was well developed in the East. And they understood when they got to this water power site on the Mississippi River that this water power was going to build a city.
The wide drop at St. Anthony Falls was ideally suited for the water wheels that captured the current, that drove the saws, that began to turn the pineries in the north into lumber and money.
I think it's important to remember that everybody who came to Minnesota expected to get rich. That's why they came here. They weren't fleeing the persecution from Wisconsin or from Illinois. So we have to think about the place as an economic landscape or a commodified landscape. People were intending to do things with it.
In the 1837 treaty signed by the Dakota and the Ojibwe, the falls and all the surrounding lands between the St. Croix and Mississippi rivers were ceded to the United States. Within hours of the news of its ratification, the rush was on. Franklin Steele, the sutler at Fort Snelling, was the first to lay claim to the east side of the falls. Later came others. Backed by Eastern capital, they understood that control of the falls meant control of all the resources that would be processed there.
They intended to build this big system, and they intended to have it make money for everybody and build a civilization. But they really didn't intend to wipe out the natural landscape and completely clear-cut the forest the way they really did. They sort of opened a Pandora's box, and in the end, they couldn't control it. It had a life of its own, and it had an impact beyond what they intended when they began to develop the water power there.
In 1847, an experienced logger from the state of Maine named Daniel Stanchfield set off to the north of St. Anthony on a scouting expedition. He was working for Franklin Steele, owner of the east side of the falls. Steele needed capital to build a sawmill and knew his investors would want a report on the timber prospects in Minnesota Territory. On the Rum River near Mille Lacs, Stanchfield encountered the southern reaches of Minnesota's white pine forest and could hardly contain himself.
I made it a practice to climb a tall tree every 6 miles and to look from its top across the woods, which reached far away in every direction. The pine was inexhaustible. 70 sawmills in 70 years couldn't exhaust the white pine I have seen on the Rum River.
What Stanchfield couldn't see, and had no way of knowing, was what lay in store for that white pine forest. What nature had taken thousands of years to grow, man would log in fewer than 50. By the middle of the 19th century, Yankee lumberers had largely used up forests in New England and Pennsylvania. They had moved quickly into the Great Lakes pineries of Michigan and Wisconsin, and still couldn't keep up with demand. In the final years of the 1830s, lumbering arrived in Minnesota. Operations began moving northward, first up the St. Croix, and soon after up the Mississippi River valleys, cherry-picking the rich white pine resources that lay close to the rivers. In the timber industry, white pine was king.
This particular individual that I'm standing next to is at least 36 to 38 inches in diameter, probably in excess of 250 years old.
They could be 200 feet tall, they could be 4 and 5 feet across at the butt. It was a tree that was easy to cut in the woods. It was a softwood tree. It was easy to mill. One sawmill owner said it was like slicing cheese. It came so finely off of the saw. It was resistant to rot and decay. It was easy to work with. It was easy to nail. It didn't split, it didn't splinter. And also, it was easy to drive on log drives. It floated high. It was called cork pine by many of the river pigs, log drivers.
Living as long as 300 years, it was the largest and longest lived of the eastern conifers, and the most majestic. Henry David Thoreau said they were like great harps by which the wind makes music. But white pines were only one part of a complex ecosystem.
You have to sit back and look at the entire North American continent. Imagine Minnesota at the western end of a great forest, of course, that stretches from the marine environments of Maine and Labrador all the way west across the Great Lakes to where the forest meets the prairie.
Here in Minnesota, the forest covered the northeastern part of the state. Made up of species from the great eastern deciduous forest to the south and the vast conifer forests of the north, this mixed forest was a patchwork of forest types. Huge stands of hardwoods and conifers, or mixed stands of both, interspersed with swamps and bogs, and patches of jack pine or oak. Fires, mostly lightning started, were constantly rearranging the mix, clearing away stands and enabling others to take their place. For pines, ground fires were crucial. Fire cleared the forest of dead trees and understory species, which competed with the growing trees for nutrients and light.
The ecology of these big pine trees is that they are dependent upon fires for their regeneration and propagation. We know from looking at historical records that you could expect a stand like this to burn catastrophically about every 250 years. But frequently there were ground fires that would come into this particular ecosystem. These occurred about on a rotation of about every 30 years. They would revisit this site, and for this reason we're seeing all kinds of trees of different sizes and diameters here, which gives the old-growth forest its fairly complex structure.
This landscape of granite-rimmed lakes, swamps and bogs was ideal for the water and nutrient-conserving needle trees. But the place was much more than just trees. Fish, birds, and other wildlife were here too, bound together in an array of complex relationships. The northern forest was also home to the Ojibwe, who valued each and every part of this landscape. The animals were hunted for food and for their fur, skin, and bones, which were used in countless ways. Maple trees were crucial for sugar. Birch was gathered for canoes, wigwams, and cooking containers. Basswood trees were used for carving wooden tools. And the Ojibwe knew and used a host of understory plants for medicinal purposes.
Here was northern Minnesota with all its land and its trees. We didn't bother other than what we needed of it. And then you have business people, and I think the entrepreneurs and corporate giants who came in and saw all these resources, and they thought, my God, look at this opportunity, you know, and they look at a tree and see BTUs and board feet of profit, you know, and they needed to get at it.
And the tree they wanted most was the white pine. Ironically, for all its majesty and importance to lumbermen, the white pine itself was only a minor part of the forest, comprising no more than 7% of all the trees.
White pine's ecology is very interesting because it's a generalist in a sense among forest tree species. It tended to grow within richer soils as a super canopy tree within the mixture of hardwood forest. And so you would have emerging white pines coming out and above the surrounding shorter in stature hardwoods. You also would have veins of it, veins of white pine in the forest. White pine often came in areas where disturbance had opened up the mineral soils.
Forest ecology hardly mattered to the timbermen. What mattered to them was the job at hand. In this earliest phase of logging, the crews were small and their tools were simple.
10 or 12 men, a couple of oxen, 2 buildings. There was a hovel for the men and a hovel for the oxen, and they said the oxen had the better of it. They had an open fire in the men's hovel, simply a campfire in the middle of the building, no chimney, just a big hole in the roof, and the smoke finally wound its way out. Beans and salt pork were the diet 3 times a day. And the men didn't specialize. They cut the lumber, they trimmed the branches, they swamped out a trail, and they brought it to the edge of the river with the ox. And it was a very, very slow process.
It was a cyclical routine that followed the seasons and the movement of water. Logging took place in the winter months, while the woods were free of underbrush and mosquitoes. In the spring, when the ice broke, the logs would be floated down to the sawmills.
The milling process utilized something called a frame saw, and it was a laboriously slow cut. In fact, they said you could turn on a sawmill and start the log moving through the saw and go out squirrel hunting. By the time you came back, that log would be sawn, and you could start the process all over again.
In conjunction with this initial cut of the upper forests of the Mississippi and St. Croix valleys, the country was changing, growing bigger and growing westward. By the mid-1800s, the seemingly limitless pine forest west of Lake Superior was attracting a growing number of wealthy entrepreneurs.
These were not your settlers coming to the west in a Conestoga wagon and seeing if they could stake out a claim. These were very well-connected people, like the Washburn family, the Morrisons, the Pillsburys were here early on. They had political connections. Franklin Steele was the son of James Buchanan's campaign manager.
Horses replaced the oxen in the woods, and men became specialized. Camps became larger. By the 1880s, technology had moved in from Michigan. Now, instead of having an ox drag a single log to the edge of the river, logs are loaded on logging sleighs. And 3,000 and 4,000 board feet of logs were put on the sleigh, and 2 or 4 horses would haul that from the pineries to the edge of the river. The speed just increased substantially. It's called highball logging. And that matched the process back in the sawmill. By the 60s and on into the 70s, steam power had reached the sawmill. That single saw was replaced by a circular saw.
With steam, the process became faster still. Steam from the sawmill engines was pumped back into the mill pond, keeping it open for logs throughout the winter. Now sawing could be done year-round. The effect on the landscape was dramatic. Small forest clearings suddenly ballooned to huge tracts of stumps and slash. By the 1870s, there were 9 sawmills on the St. Croix River at Stillwater. And 15 more at St. Anthony Falls. There was so much sawdust on the Mississippi River that it posed a navigational problem for steamboats.
The mills themselves were built on dams across the river. The logs were run through the mills and then down the sluiceway around the falls. You look at the old pictures, you see a sort of almost a shantytown effect. The banks on both sides of the river are barnacled with these sawmills grinding away the lumber.
Nowhere was the quickening cut more profoundly felt than at the Falls of St. Anthony. In 1856, owners of the east and west banks of the falls had succeeded in actually diverting the flow of water out of the main channel and into a system of canals. This enabled them to sell the falling water to sawmills and other manufacturers needing power.
As they tried to develop the water power at the falls with all of these tunnel systems, they finally reached the breaking point, quite literally.
In dividing the waters, the millers had neglected to consider nature. Beneath the falls, a cap of hard limestone rested atop a bed of softer sandstone. This limestone ledge had been eroding upstream for 12,000 years. As the cascading water scoured out the soft sandstone underlayer, chunks of limestone ledge would break off under their own weight and crash into the river.
And if it had kept going for only a few more years, arguably about 50 years or so, it would have run out of the limestone shelf that supported it.
This would have ended the falls as a source of power. By diverting the waters, the millers had further weakened the falls, until on October 5, 1869, disaster came. A tunnel collapsed and the falls started to go.
The limestone just broke apart, and the river started to reroute right through this tunnel and blast out part of Hennepin Island at the exit, and it created this giant whirlpool in the river. At first they thought they could conquer this like they'd conquered everything else. They put together these great rafts of white pine logs and floated it out there. But the whirlpool just sucked them down and made an even bigger tunnel.
In 1870, the Army Corps of Engineers was called in to build a wooden apron over the falls. With its completion, the place that was known as St. Anthony Falls was gone, effectively buried under the new commercial landscape it was so instrumental in building. And still, timber kept coming down the Mississippi. By the late 1870s, the apparently limitless white pine of the Rum River, the St. Croix, and the Mississippi had been cut. Less than 25 years after his breathless assessment of the Rum River pinery, Daniel Stanchfield wouldn't have been able to find a tall tree to climb. Meanwhile, the lumber camps kept growing, moving northward. For roughly 10,000 years, from the time of the last ice age to just after the Civil War, human-made changes on the land of Minnesota, though significant, were largely localized and gradual.
When they looked off across the prairie, they couldn't imagine it all being used up as farmland for many, many, many years, because the pace of development up to that time had been relatively steady and straightforward.
But the last years of the 19th century would bring an explosion of technologies to Minnesota. Steam power had already arrived. Railroads would stretch across the prairie and run deep into the North Woods. Steel plows, repeating rifles, and new flour milling technology all were coming. And those tools in the hands of tens of thousands of incoming settlers would bring change at a pace that would astonish even the men and women who were living it. Production of this program was made possible in part by the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, as recommended by the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, the McKnight Foundation, maintaining and restoring a healthy, sustainable environment in the Mississippi River Basin, and these funding partners.